uh, domination over the U.S. banking system was unparalleled. Maybe there are other countries where the Rothschild family might have had domination. I don't know about in Canada or in Australia and other countries, but certainly in the United States, J.P. Morgan was the person who was going to call the shots, and he bailed the banks out by making temporary loans to many of them out of his own assets. And so that brought the financial panic under control. But it was recognized that reform was needed. There was going to be a need for legislation that would, if not eliminate, at least mitigate these kinds of panics from happening again. And as you can imagine, with regard to Wall Street, the big issue was allowing people to purchase stocks with margin accounts and actually borrow the money. And how much will you be allowed to borrow in order to purchase shares of stock? And the more of a down payment that's required to purchase the stocks, the less speculation there's going to be, the less intensive of the next bubble might be. So in 1908, a U.S. Senator named Nelson Aldrich established and chaired a commission to investigate the crisis and propose solutions. And this went on for several years. In 1912, Woodrow Wilson wins the Democratic Party's nomination for the president, and he defeats Theodore Roosevelt, who ran as a progressive in what was called the Bull Moose Party. And in his acceptance speech, here's what Woodrow Wilson warned. He talked about the money trusts, and he said, a concentration of the control of credit may at any time become infinitely dangerous to free enterprise. And so he was very much in the camp of those who believed that more so than land speculation, more so than land monopoly, it was control of finances and money that was going to determine whether or not we would have a stable economic system in the future or not. And what they came up with was the Federal Reserve System in the United States. And Wilson signs the legislation to reform the nation's currency system. I just want to stop for a second and recommend to those of you who don't know Woodrow Wilson at all. He was a university professor before he got involved in politics. And in 1908, he writes a really interesting analysis of the United States Constitution. This was a book of about 300 or so pages, but it's really worthwhile getting a hold of a copy, and you can get one on archive.org and download it for free. He spends some time in the beginning chapters comparing the parliamentary system of Britain with the evolution of the ideas of the founding fathers in the United States and why they came up with the system that we have here in the United States. And he discusses the advantages and disadvantages of each system. And in the very end of the book, he does a really interesting analysis of the ongoing crisis of understanding the role between the states and the federal government, and how this impacts not only politics in the United States, but impacts the relationship between the states and federal government when it comes to legislation, and how that legislation should apply to the general citizenry versus simply those who reside in an individual state or organizations, entities that are domiciled in an individual state. And it has a lot to help explain some of the predicaments that we have experienced in the United States over the decades. And I find it particularly valuable in understanding what's going on today with the two parties sort of not able to find consensus agreement over what our public policy should be, and really steering to the margins of what would be called liberalism in the United States, both left and right. So that I think is Wilson's important contribution. Now, it raises a number of questions about why he supported this system. And there are a number of books that talk about Wilson's attitude and who influenced his thinking. And in particular, there is a lot of reference to an advisor to Woodrow Wilson named Edward House. And historians have documented that Edward House, while he's advising Woodrow Wilson on policy decisions, was being paid by J.P. Morgan. And so the views that are being conveyed to Wilson about monetary policy are coming through Edward House, and the ideas coming from J.P. Morgan. So with the Federal Reserve System, Morgan gets pretty much what he wants. He gets a system that's operated as a regulated private system and not as a government agency. The Federal Reserve Act establishes a system of 8 to 12 mostly autonomous regional reserve banks that would be owned by commercial banks and whose actions would be coordinated by a committee appointed by the president. So this is still the system we have in place now. And the questions about the Federal Reserve's efficiency, has it lived up to its promise under the legislation? That's certainly subject for a lot of discussion. But from the very start, the Federal Reserve had its harsh critics. This is just a painting of Wilson signing the legislation. But one of the earliest critics of the Federal Reserve System was Charles Lindbergh. And here's what he had to say about the act. The act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this bill, the invisible government of the monetary power will be legalized. The greatest crime of the ages is perpetuated by this banking and currency bill. And so there have been, ever since, intense debates over the Federal Reserve System, whether or not its powers should be expanded, curtailed, whether the system should be done away with altogether and replaced by something else. And in recent decades, probably the most consistently vocal critic was this fellow, Ron Paul of Texas. And Ron Paul actually has called for on numerous occasions the dissolution of the Fed. And here's what he says. His argument is, since the creation of the Federal Reserve, middle and working class Americans have been victimized by a boom and bust monetary policy. In addition, most Americans have suffered a steadily eroding purchasing power because of the Federal Reserve's inflationary policies. This represents a real, if hidden, tax imposed upon the American people. All you have to do is look at the statistics, and you see that there is this continuous loss of purchasing power of the US dollar. But it's, as you, I'm sure, can understand, it's a much more complex issue than that. Because if your individual nominal income is increasing annually at a rate greater than the depreciation in the purchasing power of the currency, then you're not experiencing inflation. You're keeping up with inflation, or you're ahead of inflation. It's that portion of our population whose nominal income is not increasing at that rate, or effectively has been declining over time due to the loss of purchasing power. So the question there is, in a sense, does the Federal Reserve have too much or too little power? Or we should consider whether its very existence causes monetary instability. Is there a way that the Fed can be given more powers to create greater stability, or is it outside of the Federal Reserve System's hands, or any central bank's hands? In the next section of our series of lectures, I title it "Idle Land: The Root Cause of Economic Depressions." And this is Henry George's perspective, one that I share, and I'm sure some of you, joining me here share. So we have this difficult time deciding in an environment where monetary policy and monetary systems get all the attention, how can we refocus attention on land markets, on the markets for natural resources and other natural assets, and how important the rents yielded from those assets are in determining whether or not we have a stable or unstable economic environment. So the monetary debate, and I think many of you who've attended other lectures recently here and are maybe attending the lectures about Silvio Gazelle, you're getting a lot of this at the same time as I'm giving it to you as well. So back then in 1907, there's still the remnants of this debate about whether currency ought to be backed by one or more precious metals, by gold, silver, or both. Should we have a system of bimetallism? And this was a major political issue in the last couple of decades of the 19th century. One of the reasons this was an issue is that trade with China during the 18th and 19th centuries drained both Europe and the United States of large quantities of silver. The Chinese wanted payment for whatever they were trading with silver. And so gold gradually replaced silver as the mandated backing for most currencies. However, in the United States, in parts of the United States, silver was still much more widely available than gold. And so that was one of the reasons why there was this continued debate. Legislation had been passed in 1873 that embraced the gold standard and demonetized silver. 20 years later, the argument is still going on. Mining interests and, quote, Westerners unsuccessfully fought against this, and then they found a champion in the Democratic Party to try to bring this issue to a fore, and that was William Jennings Bryan. Bryan, in this cartoon here, has a cross of gold, and he's arguing that we don't want to let ourselves be hung on this cross of gold. Bryan called for bimetallism. He campaigned for the presidency in 1896, and his most famous speech was titled "No Cross of Gold." And in that speech, he declares basically, if protection has slain its thousands, the gold standard has slain its tens of thousands. So he's introducing another issue, protection. All throughout the 19th century into the 20th century, tariffs is a big issue. Going back, you remember in the earlier discussion, so in the years when the Constitution was established in the United States, you had the Hamiltonian view that industry in the United States needed to be subsidized. It needed to have protectionism from foreign competition so that it could become established and become competitive. Then the idea that Hamilton said was, once the U.S. can demonstrate it's on an equal footing with other producers, then we can do away with tariffs. But as you can imagine and expect, those who had benefited from the tariffs and protectionist statutes over time were unwilling to give them up. I mean, this is how they gained above market profits, and so they continued to fight for tariffs. So the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the progressives, everyone is on one side of these issues or another. And so now we have a number of different issues coming together around the issue of trade and around the issue of taxation and around the issue of monetary policy. And now this same issue comes back to what Woodrow Wilson was writing about, whether or not the issuance of money should be solely the responsibility of government, and if so, should it be solely the responsibility of the federal government, or should state governments be able to issue currency? And there were arguments back and forth on that, or that go on as well. There's great fear about centralized control of money issuance. but there's also the practical issues that we talked about last week with regard to state chartered banks. If those banks are issuing their own currency, then you have the question of the wildcat currency problem and how reliable that currency is in terms of its exchangeability. And with the states, if they issued their own money, have specie in a vault somewhere where you could bring your paper currency to the state office and get real specie money in exchange for it. So none of these issues are fully resolved. And one issue, of course, is going to be what should back the currency, if anything. Is it simply the full faith and credit of the United States government if it's a federal system, or does it have to be something tangible, some kind of commodity? So you have these issues: government issued currency versus central bank issued currency versus private bank issued currency. Some of you are familiar with this fellow, Stephen Zarlenga. Marty Rowland has talked about his work a lot. He founded the American Monetary Institute in 1996. He extensively researched the history of money and banking and credit. A book he wrote was published that's 800, 900 pages. So it's not an easy subject to get your arms around if you want to really understand all of the history. In a speech he delivered in 2004, he brought up the problem created by mainstream economists. And this is what he said then. One reason economists have failed mankind so badly is their poor methodology and over-reliance on theoretical reasoning. Alexander Delmar, the world's greatest monetary historian, noted, quote, "As a rule, economists don't take the trouble to study the history of money. It is much easier to imagine it and to deduce the principles of this imaginary knowledge." Some of us would say that almost describes macroeconomic theory. Zarlenga believed we should do the following. He had several different specific proposals to cure this problem. He says, first, we must nationalize the Federal Reserve System, reconstitute the Fed within the U.S. Treasury to eventually evolve into a fourth branch of government on a par with the executive, judicial, and legislative branches. And C, restrict the creation of money to the federal government. This last recommended reform is one that Henry George would certainly have supported. Anyway, I'm stopping there and going on to what is counter to all of this centralized thinking that we've talked about so far. And this comes out of the history of free banking. And free banking argues, again, that any banking entity could issue its own banknotes and that market forces would be relied upon to control the supply of banknotes and the quantity and form of reserves that's required to meet demands for specie by depositors. And reserves would be in the form of gold, silver, or possibly other scarce commodities that have a stable value. So who was one of the architects of this idea? Our old friend, Fred Foldvari. Fred, who taught economics at Santa Clara University, believed free banking would work very efficiently and with little corruption. And he wrote extensively on this, but here's just one argument that he makes. Excuse me for just a sec. He says the artificial increase in money supply can be halted permanently by implementing free banking. Without a central bank and a national currency imposed on the economy, inflation of the money supply beyond the growth of the economy is no longer feasible, since there is no longer a monopoly of the money supply. So there's a cogent argument in total opposite direction of where we seem to be headed. Whether or not it's the right argument, I don't know. But again, there were the criticisms we talked about last week about free banking and the question of how would you regulate it, audit it to make sure that what Fred is arguing, would actually happen. So there are more voices on this whole issue. One was by Norman Curlin, and he operated something called the Center for Economic and Social Justice in Washington. He was a longtime collaborator with Louis Kelso, and Kelso, as some of you may know, was really the architect of the idea that resulted in employee stock ownership plans. They worked on the legislation that allowed for the first employee stock ownership plans and 401k plans that, in the United States at least, have largely supplanted the kind of defined pension fund programs, where now you invest the money, and however that money invested in your 401k does, that's what's your retirement is going to be. Whereas before, with a defined pension program, you're going to get, for a number of years service, you're going to get X amount of money every month sent to you in a check. Curlin and others advocated is that a society where every person derives income from ownership of shares of stock would be a society that was characterized by greater equality of opportunity or greater equality of outcomes. And so they came up with what they called the Capital Homestead Plan, and they tried to get legislation passed in order to do this. And basically, his idea was this: the Capital Homestead Act's central focus is the democratization of capital productive credit. By universalizing citizen access to direct capital ownership through access to interest-free productive credit, it would close the power and opportunity gap between today's haves and have-nots, not without taking any property from today's owners. This was his way to get around the vested interests of those who are already significant haves. And basically what it would mean is that you as an employee would be able to borrow money at zero interest in order to acquire shares of stock in the company you worked for. And so as the shares of stock increased in value, you would then have, you'd have dividends, and you would have equity in those share values that you could use to pay off the interest-free loans. And at the end of your working life, ostensibly, you would have sufficient shares that you own without debt that you now have a substantial retirement nest egg. Would it work? I don't know. Ready to mention Mortimer Adler and Kelso's working together. They teamed up in the late 1950s to write a sharp critique of the American economic system in two books, The Capitalist Manifesto and The New Capitalists. And they worked together to develop their program of universal capitalism. In the preface to The Capitalist Manifesto, this is the two books, Adler explains that the ideas of economics are those of Kelso, but he came to embrace them as someone who believed in social democracy. His primary concern had been on how to preserve and nurture democracy. And so he wrote as follows. He says, in the 20 years or more in which I have been developing a theory of democracy as the only perfectly just form of government, I slowly came to realize that political democracy cannot flourish under all economic conditions. He goes on, he says, democracy requires an economic system which supports the political ideals of liberty and equality for all. Men cannot exercise freedom in the political sphere when they are deprived of it in the economic sphere. Yeah, this is part of the challenge we have politically, because there's a great deal of disagreement over whether or not the economic system that we have is the best that we can do versus something better. And a lot of people seem to be perfectly satisfied with the distribution of income and wealth as it is, as the best that we can do. And others of us are much less satisfied for various reasons, whether it's, land monopoly, money monopoly, other sorts of economic privileges that exist, and that's what we keep debating about. Well, back in 1933, one way for government to try to stabilize the economy was to exert direct control over the monetary system. So in 1933, the United States government took the dramatic step of closing down the gold market and ending its commitment to redeem gold certificates. And this seems to be the constant problem with a gold-backed money. Is like there's never quite enough, and we run into this problem of when others demand gold from us that's in our vaults, because they're no longer willing to accept the paper currency, then the system starts to break down. And maybe that's what Keynes was getting to, with the need for, a global currency. Bretton Woods seems to have a lot of quasi movement in that direction, like with special drawing rights. I've never been able to figure out how that all was designed to work, with so many different currencies and countries having to become depositors in the system. But apparently, Keynes was pretty frustrated after Bretton Woods, wasn't he? All of this discussion about money, as important as it is, can't be resolved by us, because it requires a very specific set of legislative measures being adopted, both at the level of national governments and somewhere internationally. So what do individual countries do to protect themselves from the worst of the downturns? And so what I want to do next week is to go into this whole discussion of the causes of economic recessions and depressions. And certainly Henry George's analysis looks to land speculation and land monopoly as major contributors to that. Monetary reformers have focused on the roles played by money, banking, and credit, but George concluded the causes were much more, even more basic. And so that's what I plan to do next week. A fundamental question is whether that portion of the economy engaged in financial transactions adds to the production of actual wealth or merely results in its redistribution. Is there a loser for every winner? Is it a zero-sum game that we have today? What are we producing sufficient capital goods, which are the necessary goods to produce the support our standard of well-being, as well as consumer goods on top of it? We're almost through the discussion on money. I wanted to just cover the last few slides for tonight and remind everyone that this process that we're going through right now seems to have started in the 1970s. Political leaders in the US in particular, and their economic advisors, committed the nation to a long process of deregulation of the financial services sector, and what they thought was a greater or supposed reliance on competitive forces to discipline the activities of individual players. That's what Fred Folvari is arguing when he talks about moving back to a free banking system. Well, we've had in this country and in other countries just a whole long series of legislation that has been designed to unleash, the banking sector, the financial sector, from regulation. There have been many pieces of it. Jimmy Carter signed the piece of legislation that created the first money market mutual funds in the United States. And they started out slowly, but eventually, what did they do? Well, everyone who had their money in a local savings and loan association or a savings bank, this is the entity that made the mortgage loans to people who were buying homes in that community traditionally, okay? Now, all of a sudden, depositors said, oh my, I could put my money in the money market mutual fund and not get 2.5%, but I can get 5% because the money market mutual fund is not subject to the same restrictions. So what happens with that over time? Hundreds of billions of dollars get withdrawn from the local savings banks and they go out of business. We have the S&L crisis, and one after another of these financial crises with deregulation. With the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, same kind of thing. Previously, it was, it prevented a banking entity from basically being an investment house as well. Now that's no longer the case. And how much resistance is there getting back to that, relationship where a commercial bank was a lender to businesses and individuals, and an investment bank was a whole different entity. So we have moved a long way after a long period of recognizing the faults in the system and trying to correct them. Somehow we got very complacent, or we got convinced that we had gone too far, and so we've rolled back all of these, previous regulations, and without a whole lot of sense of where it was going to end up. So now that the global economy is poised for what many of us think is the next systemic failure to occur in 2026. There's an almost endless list of analysts who have offered their interpretation of what happened and why, and I just grabbed a handful of them. And so it seems to me, based on the last part of my working career, that the kind of deregulation that resulted in the subprime mortgage loan crisis of the late 1990s and early 2000s, this was something that those of us on the inside working day to day on with individual customers saw coming. We saw this coming really quick, but could do nothing about it. And a big part of that was because the nation's property markets had become so overheated that there was no longer the ability for a lot of people to enter them, particularly first-time home buyers. They were cut out, and the whole market was just set up to crash because it was credit fueled and speculation driven. And then the Federal Reserve's response was textbook. Do all that could be done to convince investors and potential buyers that property prices would recover and climb to new heights. So they reduced mortgage interest rates to less than 3%. That did the trick. And now we have here, 2024, we have residential property prices higher than they've ever been in history, and interest rates rising again to try to deal with the Fed's way of dealing with inflation, and we're set for another crash. And I think when we look at George's analysis of the causes of economic depressions next week and land speculation, we'll see that this cannot be avoided by anything that the federal government, the national government in the United States, or other governments are going to be able to do unless they deal with land monopoly and deal with land speculation. And so that's where I leave you this week, with one last cartoon that shows the perfect metaphor for what our financial people have done.